The human family. Wow, what a journey. But what we can say is the human family is expanding our understanding of the universe, our understanding of the planet, that unbelievable thing we're a part of. We're growing larger and more inclusive understandings that develop new ways of talking about who we are and what constitutes genuine and sustaining health and wholeness. It's a journey. And at the same time, our focus has also allowed us to see finer and finer nuances of all the bits and pieces that make up this growing grand vision, this grand view of being, life, and consciousness, of how the essential processes of complexification and differentiation and self-permeability move us to ever new realities and inspire these growing and expanding understandings. It's a process and it's happening, man. It's moving us and we're moving it. So when it comes to human values, it's about how we fit together with the world and the environment as well as each other. And that's what we're going to talk about a little bit today, more than a little bit, I hope. Studies have shown that there is an evolving understanding of how we fit and what are the higher values that can steer the human family in more healthy ways that can engender wholesome relationships and facilitate a world that grows together. How do we talk about these higher values? What are they? And it's interesting because, the new paradigms, these new orders of understanding that the human family is path making are quite amazing. And I would recommend a portal that comes out of Europe called researchgate.net. There are more articles and research about exactly what I'm talking about and how all the global pieces fit on so many levels. But today we're talking about human values. And let's talk about the 4 big values that came out of a number of studies. The first is openness to change. Okay? The second is self-enhancement. The third is conservation. And the fourth is self-transcendence. And I'll break these down a little bit. Openness to change, that means being free to cultivate your own ideas and abilities and actions. And freedom is part of a lot of this. Openness, that semi-permeability we've talked about. Self-enhancement, that's the power to control your own self and also have a say in the system. It's about the power to control your own resources, materials, and social connections, that you're open and free to do this. Self-enhancement. Conservations, this has to do with security. It's about maintaining safety and harmony and stability. It's in both society and our relationships. Very important. As well, this conservation piece includes conformity. That's to a restraint of actions and impulses that might harm others and the environment. This is rules and laws stopping at red lights and things like that. But also regulating. There's some people I'd like to do harm to, but I do not because, one, I can't get close to them, but two, I restrain that. And of course, the other part of conservation is tradition, and that's respecting other religions and cultures and people of differences. Amazing piece. And again, the fourth major value, self-transcendence. There's a couple pieces to this. One is benevolence, and this is to preserve and enhance the welfare of your friends and those around you, to be reliable and trustworthy. And with benevolence comes universalism, which is basically applying that same thing to all people and to nature. It's a commitment to equality, justice, protection, and again, respecting those who are different and those and the natural world itself. Openness to change, self-enhancement, conservation, and self-transcendence. It's a good place to start our conversation because I'll be honest, there is no real fundamental place to start our conversation. It's basically the human family's in new territory and trying to define these greater values that can allow us to live together and to live in this world. and to have a positive effect on both the health and wholeness of not just the individual, not just our cultures and societies, but nature herself. So I just laid out a big, again, I do a shotgun blast. So Bob, I'll open with you. Bob's coming from Florida. Marianne's coming from Spokane Valley in Washington State. I'm in Spokane, Washington, up on the South Hill. And we're going to let Bob give his response to my shotgun blast.
Well, first of all, I thought that was a very well put together summary. But as you were going through these, the thought that occurred to me was that the history of humans looking for higher values goes back thousands of years. We've talked about the golden rule. We've talked about various things in various religions that have been developed over the years to help us get along with each other and help us try and form a more just society. And the thought I had was, all of these values that have been developed over the years were developed for fairly small groups. When you look at the global population that we're dealing with today, they talk about, Athens being the first democracy. Well, that was one city, and only a few of the people in that city were able to participate in their democracy. Yeah, it was a big step forward, but still they were dealing with just a few people. And even when you get to the point where our founding fathers were writing the Constitution and trying to come up with ways in which 13 states could get along with each other and form or move toward a more perfect union, they were still just dealing with a small part of the world. Today, we're in a different paradigm, to use that same word. We are dealing globally now. And we have to deal globally because of the constraints that we're under as a global society. We've talked about them in a lot of different episodes. But the importance of looking for global values today is really a survival mechanism, because we can't survive as a species unless we learn collectively to get along in a global society. And we've got a long way to go, but I think that discussions like this and discussions like you find on the website you were just quoting are helping us move toward that goal of values that all can share throughout the world.
Amen. Marianne, what say you?
Well, I think both of you have made some very, very good points, and my mind goes to, you talk about these smaller groups, and yet the ripple effect from those smaller groups permeated out to culture and society and through history. And so we're even still talking about these things today. So I think when I think of our global community, if we think of it in terms of a galactic community, the Earth is one very small place in this huge, vast system. And so we do have to figure out, as one world, how do we get along? And what are human values? What is it that we are going to promote globally that is going to be something that will connect us all? I think about things like we are connected. What pops into my head are the stand of aspens, where you see all of these trees and yet they have one single root system. So if human beings are all part of the same thing, and I think one of the things that COVID showed us very, very, very clearly is that we are connected. We breathe in and we breathe out, and we share that same air. We're part of the same system, and we are affected by the things that happen physically, but also emotionally, mentally, and politically. We're all connected. We're all we're all acting together, and yet there are things that are going to destroy us, and there are things that are going to enhance the human race. And that's where we have to come together and figure out what are those.
Well, and I think we are,
and
I think that's what I tried to lay out, that the human family is working on those. And if you look at the four: openness to change, self-enhancement, conservation, and self-transcendence, you see that that's something we can all buy into.
That's how we do it.
That's
right?
how we do
exactly.
it. We develop a way of talking about it. And Bob, I think you said something really important. Why we need this is because today everything is existential. There are nothing is bound by a small group. And yet, as Margaret Mead said, all change usually comes from a small group. So keep the small groups going and set the world on fire. And I think that's what we're trying to do. We're one small little voice in this great cacophony of podcasts. And I pray that the podcasts to set the world on fire with benevolence and universalism and security that we can all buy into without getting lost in our power systems. And we can learn to rephrase our value systems in a way that does not put us against them, but realize there is no us against them when it comes to the planet. It's all or nothing. And I think that these higher values are trying to somehow reach for what is this system that fits everything together in a way that allows us all to grow and in good ways. Go ahead, Bob. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to.
No, that's okay. The one thing that I didn't hear in those four areas of value that you were mentioning is, and it probably is there as you dig deeper, but and that is equal justice for all.
Well, and that is included in the conformity. And which is basically, let me see where I have that. It's self-transcendence, which is basically universalism, which creates a commitment to equality, justice, and protection of differences in the natural world and each other. So it's, this is an outline of a huge paper, man.
Oh, for sure. But that's something that we've constantly been struggling with. I mean, you look back into the original version of the Constitution, black people were not regarded as fully human. They were only, I'll probably get the fraction wrong, 2/3 of a human, or 3/5, I think it is. And look at the struggle we're still going through. Look at the struggle between a rich person in the justice system and a poor person in the justice system. If justice is for all, and if the laws are for all, then there shouldn't be that divide.
Well, now, you see, I think it's important for us to realize that we're talking about what are the higher values. What you're talking about is we're getting jammed up in the lower values, and we're not. How do we get these higher values into the life stream of everyday human people? And now, again, I'm going back to stories and all kinds of other things because I think it's going on there.
But I think you've made the point in previous podcasts that, and I'm paraphrasing, and I'm probably going to get it wrong here, but the idea is that justice only occurs when the least among us has that justice. So there's got to be a way for a value that regards the least as the most important as a guiding value.
And if you put the whole concept of equality in self-transcendence and in the conservation piece together with openness to change, which is basically to cultivate your own ideas, your own abilities, your own actions, that creates an equality, and not just an equality, but an equity, where everybody is given the same value, the same worth, and is given the opportunity to explore the parameters of their own nature, if you will. And I mean, we're talking idealism here, so I want to stay on the idealism thing because there's so much other stuff that wants to suck us down, and I want to give our listeners something to reach for at the higher level. And I think this is a good way, we're trying to find a way to talk about these things. Again, openness to change, self-enhancement, conservation, and self-transcendence. I want people to get these down and see that the human family, we're all reaching for this, man.
Well, and also every single one of those involves the self. And so it begins with each one of us. And each one of us has to work on this ourselves, and then we take it out into our communities. And then we support each other in trying to do that, because those things sound very simple, but they're not. They're complex. Open to change, it sometimes can be very difficult to change if you've been indoctrinated since birth with certain ideas and certain beliefs, and to understand that possibly those are incorrect and have to explore it. And that's where community comes in. That's where conversations like the ones we're having comes in. Because you have to be able to talk to other people and share these things, and so that you can, and be open to listen, be open to learning something new.
And this is where it brings in an important perspective, because Marianne, you said it's really about the self, and yet the whole model of values could not happen within the self. It happens within a relational context of community. So we have to see that who we are as ourself is not just what's inside the skin. And this is where the oneness of being comes in. But it's all these tentacles of relational things that are happening simultaneously and are in process, within and without. And the whole thing makes us up. And this is why these values, they have to come out of, our last podcast was about diversity. It has to come out of the diversity. It has to come out of this greater perspective that includes the neighbor that pisses me off as well as the damn mosquito.
Because that's telling you something about you. When something pisses you off, it tells you something about your values and what you want to do.
That's right.
And I think we negate our personal agency and our own personal power way too much, because that's the beginning of those relationships. That's the beginning of communication, is we have to be able to reach out and understand that, just like I talked about with the idea of COVID, every breath I take and every breath you take, we are sharing something.
That's right.
We share this air, we share this planet, and being able to understand that we each have responsibility here. And that is to be the best that we can be. And sometimes it can be painful.
Yeah. And as you said that, just as a sidebar, every second or third breath has a higher than 50% value that you're breathing in some of the molecules Jesus breathed in.
Right.
Sorry, I just had to say that.
I remember you saying that at one point a long time ago. I love that.
I was going to observe, and I go back to Carl Jung just about every time I start thinking about deep thoughts, And Carl Jung put the self as the center of his whole philosophy. But we've talked about the self being the balance of all of these different complexes and things that occur within the human mind. That's only half of it, or maybe less than half. At least half of the self is what is part of nature, part of what he called the unconscious. And that's those connections that you're talking about, Marianne. That's all the connections that each individual has with the planet. All of the other people, all of the animals, all of the plants, and a true flowering of the self has to have both of those aspects. The internal balancing of all of the different pieces of our minds and the connections with everything else.
Amen.
Yeah.
And I want to just remind our listeners that this is our best guess. I mean, we're just three everyday people taking our hearts and our minds and the archive of our soul and trying to put it in the best interest of the human family. After all my study, this is my best guess. I've learned to research pretty good, so the higher values I laid out. We're trying to find a way to talk about stuff that human beings have never talked about before. It's kind of like computer science. They had to come up with all kinds of new ways of talking about stuff. We talk about a bug in the system. Well, it was a mainframe, and the woman who was running the Navy system went into the mainframe, and she found a moth that was in one of the relays. And they said, "What's wrong?" And she said, "There's a bug in the system," and it stuck. But it was a real moth in a relay because they didn't have that, binary was on or off. And it's the way that we develop language to talk about things. Bob, I'm glad you come back to Carl Jung. I always go back to Campbell and Jung myself because their language helps ferret out some of the finer nuances so that we can discern what are the deeper values. That, you brought up the golden rule. It's everywhere. How is it something so universal, so particular, I should say, emerged everywhere? It's more everywhere than the pyramids. And it's a value. It's a deep value of the human soul. We've talked about the two main metaphors of afterlife, reincarnation and heaven and hell. We don't know whether either one of them is real, but my best guess is what they both say is that the human being wants justice. There's something in our deepest hearts that craves justice. When someone does something wrong, we want them to get theirs. When someone does something really wonderful, we want them to get theirs. It's in our soul. And these deeper values, these higher values that we're talking about, we're trying to not make them up, but evoke them, that they might emerge with more clarity. Go ahead, Marianne. I'm babbling, but I love this conversation.
I hate to interrupt, but I keep thinking that, the idea of a new language to describe this stuff, but these are ancient conversations. These are conversations that have been going on. I think what's happening now is they're becoming more mainstream. These are the conversations that used to happen in mystery schools and in cloisters and in small groups. And now we're trying to bring this same kind of connection and conversation, the unconscious, back out into the general public, so that everyone recognizes that they are a part of this.
Yeah. And a piece that you brought up, there's a new context. That's what's different. It's an ancient conversation, but the tools we have at our disposal makes this an existential issue. We have hit the point of diminishing returns, if you will. And the whole planet now, that's why I speak in terms of the human family, we are being forced to actually address these aspects of our nature if we are to survive. And I think, Bob, you brought that up in your opening thing. This is a survival issue. It's existential for the human family. I assure you, if we wipe ourselves out, the roaches will still be around. Alligators will probably still be around,
Yeah.
A point of diminishing returns. If we can't find a way to integrate these values into everywhere, if we can't get buy-in, if you will, from the power systems, then the power systems will be contrary to the existence of the human family.
Right, and that recognize the dignity of every single person. And I think you were talking about that earlier, Bob, with the justice piece, because we all have to understand that we are connected, and I am you and you are me, and we are all together, right? Isn't that a Beatles song?
Oh, yeah.
So, like I said, I don't think this is anything new. I think it's just, and you bring up a really good point. We are in a different context. We can blow ourselves off the planet right now, and do we want to do that?
Well, we can just slow boil. We don't even need to blow ourselves up. We'll just slowly boil ourselves if we keep going.
Yeah.
I think that's already been happening for 50 years, 50 or 60 years. So we've been at a slow boil, and it's starting to bubble over.
Wildfires across the country right now. It's speeding up.
Right.
Yeah. And let me just throw in something that we've talked about before, and that's the idea that humans need to be tricked into enlightenment, if you will. And that's, you get the stories and so forth. But again, this is an ancient thing too. The whole idea of the trickster is found in many, many ancient cultures. Hermes was the trickster god, and really his job was to open doors for people to walk through so they could see a new way of viewing themselves and the world around them. And he literally tricked them into that. And people resist change. So that's where we have to figure out ways to make the idea of them changing more palatable, and letting them see that the person that they don't have regard for is equal to them, is as important as them. And some of that happened when blacks were integrated into the military, and people had to literally fight shoulder to shoulder with people who they had never had any kind of interactions with before. And suddenly they came out and they said, well, this guy's just like me, and they were tricked into that.
Yeah, boy, that was a brutal trick. And I hate to say it, but we've been tricked into the trick of time, and we're kind of coming to the end of our time. So, Marianne, final comments here?
I love what you just said, Bob. So the idea that these people, they're just like me. And I think what we have to understand is when we can get in and know ourselves, we can know others. And because others are just like us. And that connection and that is very important. And even when we don't agree with them, and even when, we have to self-regulate. You talked about that with the conservation. We have to self-regulate ourselves, and there are times when we have to regulate others because their actions are harming others. And so knowing that balance, and coming back to balance, right? Knowing that balance is crucial to going forward.
Amen. Bob, final comments?
Well, I think Marianne just summed it up very well. The idea is that we all have to make sacrifices to the greater good. And if we only think that the other person is the one that has to make the sacrifices, then that balance is out of kilter. We have to realize that as individuals, we have to make sacrifices, and we have to realize that other people have to make sacrifices in order for all of us to get along. And that in itself may be a higher value.
Yeah. Wow. And Bob, your previous comments, they really gave me, that they would have been great segue for where we're going next. Because there are these truths that are so freaking difficult to own. I can't remember what comic it was, but he said, I can't even speak the truth if it's not funny. And I'm watching the George Carlin special, and I go, holy mackerel, cheesy peasy. So you know where we're going next? Comics, tricksters, and difficult truths. How they slip by us. How do they get in? We talk about semi-permeability. Well, we think we're in control of that. There are these little openings. And when we laugh, they open a little bit further, and some shit gets in, man. And it messes us up, and we have to change. And, oh, man, that joke had more than joke in it. And I'm not talking about just jokes, because there's some really good jokes out there. I got my favorites, and I'm going to pull them on you. I think I've already pulled a couple on you. But comics, tricksters, and difficult truths. Man, we need an orator that can just speak it and nail it and George Carlin it, and at the same time keep stability. My God, help us. My friends, God's peace, and in all things, may your hearts stay open.